My name is Landon Rain. Thank you for joining me in my studio. Today I'll show you how I made my song Unrecognized. Let's get into it.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces, talk about something real and dig it. No cheers, no tears, no.
Before we start, I just wanted to let you know that you can download the whole instrumental for this song over on my Patreon for free. Please consider subscribing to me over there if you want to support what I do. Also, this song is on all streaming services, so you can listen to it if you like. So I had this exact idea for the choir with the melody and with the lyrics for a very long time, so I started with that.
What if I stay unrecognized for the rest of my life? Ooh,
Because I get a lot of questions about that, I just wanted to take you through the process of how I kind of approach my choirs. First thing that I start with, like 99% of the time, is the main melody, which in this case sounds like this.
what if I stay unrecognized for the rest of my life?
But from the kind of questions that I got, I feel like the problem that most people have with making their own choirs is what to do after that step. Like, how do you come up with the layers that go underneath that main melody? So I'm just gonna show you how I kind of approach that. So after I come up with my main melody, I just pull up like a super basic stock instrument. I usually choose a piano. After I got that pulled up, I click in that melody inside of my MIDI track. So now I have the notes of my main melody. What if I stay? So that's basically the start of the whole choir. So a very easy way to find out what chords will go with that melody is just by looking at the notes that are inside of the melody. So we can see right here we have a D, an E, an F sharp, and a G. Now, because I know a little bit about music theory, I know that those notes are inside of the G major scale. Now you have to decide what kind of vibe you're going with for your song. For me, I wanted to have like a darker vibe, so I'm not going with the G major scale, but with the relative minor scale. An easy way to find out the relative minor scale of a major scale is just by taking the root note of the scale, which is in this case G, and then going 3 semitones down. So F sharp, F, E. And now I know E minor is the relative minor scale. So now I know every chord that is inside of the E minor scale will go with those notes right here. So the chord that I chose to harmonize with for that first motif is E minor 7. So as I guess most of you know, E minor 7 consists of E, G, B, and D. So now I know when I'm layering notes below each of those main melody notes, I have all of those 4 notes to choose from. So let's just listen to every single layer that I did, and I'll show you the kind of notes that I chose to go with the main melody.
What if I stay?
So that's the first layer.
What if I stay?
If we go down to our MIDI right now, we can see that I just used the 7th and the 5th to harmonize the main melody. Moving on to the next layer.
What if I stay?
So now if we go down to our MIDI again, we can see that I used the root note and the 3rd of the E minor chord for that layer. Moving on to the next one.
What if I stay?
So if you have a pretty good ear, you can hear that those were the exact same notes, but just in the reversed order. So I used the 3rd and the root note of the E minor chord. And for the lowest layer of every choir, I'm just using the root note and just nothing else.
What if I stay?
Just to check if we go to our MIDI again. Alright, so those are the basic of just coming up with the notes to actually use to harmonize. So now we can get into some of the details to make my choir sound a little bit more interesting and I guess more realistic as well. I give each layer a different movement. So I'm looking at movements in between the notes that I'm singing. Let's just listen to the very first layer.
What if I stay?
A lot of movement there. It's going down, then up, then down again. So now let's listen to the second layer.
What if I stay?
We're staying the same and at the end we're going down. Let's listen to the next layer.
What if I stay?
We're staying the same, but at the end we're going up. Let's listen to the next layer.
What if I stay?
Staying the same, at the end we're going down again. And for the very last layer,
What if I stay?
it just stays the same the whole time. So each layer has like a different movement, and I just try to visualize the choir as lines. I don't want the lines to just be parallel the whole time. I want them to cross and meet at some points and move in different directions to just give a lot more movement to the choir and just make it a lot more alive and less robotic, you know? Those kind of really straight movements, that's what a vocoder would do. But we're humans, we want to have like a human feel, or at least that's what I want to have for my choirs. So I always try to make them move around, just make them sound a lot more interesting. All right, that's basically everything you need to know theory-wise. Now, recording-wise, what I do, I usually record the main melody 5 times, and each time I'm recording, I'm moving to a different position relative to the mic to just make it sound a lot more full and make it sound like people are standing at different positions and make it sound like it's an actual choir and multiple people are singing it. For all of the other layers, I'm doing 3 takes. Again, just changing my position relative to the mic. As you can see right here, there is no processing on the individual tracks. All I'm doing with the individual tracks is panning. And my rule of thumb is the higher the melody, the wider I'm panning. So you can see the main melody, I pan it super hard left and super hard right. And the lower we go, if we look at the bass layer, I only did like -5 and +5, so barely panning it at all. That just gives it a lot more depth while also keeping the bass more focused, because the bass tends to make your stereo image sound a little bit muddy. So definitely keep the bass in the middle and make the highs super wide, and that's gonna give your choir that size that I guess most of you are looking for. At least that's what I want in my choirs. Let's see what I did processing wise. I just combed all of my tracks together in one group, and then I just process the whole group. So the first thing that I did was use this tube preamp.
What if I stay unrecognized for the rest of my life? Ooh.
The fact that it's distorting is not a mistake that I just made. It's actually what I wanted, because I just wanted it to be a lot more compressed and a little bit more aggressive and saturated. So I kind of overdid it, but I'm treating that distortion with an EQ later. The next thing I use is this direction mixer. It's a Logic stock plugin, and it allows you to spread or narrow down your signal. And I wanted it because vintage records are mostly, they're like very narrow and a little bit more mono. So I didn't want that choir to have the really modern, I guess, type of stereo image, which is like super wide. So I kind of narrowed it down. The next thing I used is this EQ, which is really taking care of the frequencies that are distorting.
What if I stay unrecognized?
It still has that kind of vintage character, kind of distorted, saturated character, but it's not overdone. That's kind of what I wanted to do with that. Super basic. I know my personal problematic frequency range is about 150 to 500 hertz. So that's what I usually attenuate when I feel like my voice sounds a little bit muddy. After that is a basic compressor. This is just Logic stock compressor, and I think this is the preset that comes up when you just open it up, and I just left it.
What if I stay unrecognized?
It worked for me. If it sounds good, then I'm not gonna touch anything, so I just didn't. So this chain is what you'll usually see without the direction mixer when I'm doing vocals. I have a preamp, I have an EQ, a compressor, and after that I put a de-esser, because that's the point where the S's really start to come out.
What if I stay?
So especially on the stay, it's really doing a good job at taking that down so it's not as harsh. I always use this male S preset. It attenuates around 4.5K. Then I just take the threshold down until I feel like it's not taking away the crispness of the vocals, but only attenuating the S's that I wanted to. At the very end of the signal chain, I just used plate reverb. This is the pure plate by Universal Audio. I don't always use the same reverb. I don't always use the same settings. I'm always experimenting with that and tweaking it to where I feel like it fits the vibe of the entire song, you know? So none of these settings are ever going to happen exactly like that again. It just worked for this song. So the only other thing that I added for the intro was this OBX sub bass, which came from the Arturia OBX plugin. So super subby, almost no high-end information. The only thing that I wanted to achieve with this was to kind of add energy before I have this super harsh cut out. Because right here it's just silence. I even automated the reverb right here so it goes down to 0%. And that sub just makes the choir distort in a really nice way, and it adds that kind of tension, and I love the contrast that it creates to that absolute silence that happens afterwards. So I usually like to have a super short build-up element that just helps me to create a really high amount of tension in a very short amount of time. I just love working with contrast like that, and I love finding ways to increase the amount of contrast that I'm working with. Alright, so now we have the whole intro down. Let's move on to the next part.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces talk about something real and dig it. No cheers, no tears, no fears. Bad minds and bitches, but they can never fuck with my love. Might stay unknown, but never alone.
Alright, the first thing that we're going to look at is the drums. So those sound like this. First thing that I added for the drums was this drum machine designer, and this is a new technique that I kind of been doing for my drums. I don't go through all my sounds for every new sound. I go into a kit, which in this case was one of Cryptic's kits. Shout out Cryptic. I just kind of go through the kit and find sounds that I like and that I feel like will match the vibe of the project, and I just drag them into the drum machine designer, and after that I close my kits folder so I don't touch it again. And now I have this curated pack of sounds that I think will go well with the song, and then I make my drum pattern out of that. As you can see, I barely used like half of the sounds that I curated, but the ones that I used were this kick. I layered 2 kicks together here. Here's a single kick and then this tom kind of thing. The next thing that I added was this snare. Another thing that I really love doing is creating my own drum sounds specifically for that project that I'm working on. The way I approached some of these sounds that are coming up, and this one right here, is I just put up my mic and then I went around my room and tried to find things that will make some kind of drum sound. And then I just go up to the mic, hit those things together, go through my room again, look for something else, hit those things together, and then I have like 5 to 6 recordings in that one audio file. After that, I will cut up each of those 6 recordings and layer them. And then I have this like really cool layered kind of perk sound, which I then drag into Logic Sampler for further detailed editing. I usually like having like a very steep fade, which just gets rid of all of the room reverb and makes it sound a little bit more in your face and gives you room to add your own reverb. This is what it sounds like straight out of the sampler, so completely raw. So very different. The first thing that I did was take out some of the lows, that just the unnecessary low end that the mic picks up. After that, and that is the real game changer, is Torque by Waves, which makes it sound from this to this. So it's like a frequency shifter. You can select like a focus range, and then with this big knob in the middle right here, you can shift those frequencies down. And this is really cool for adding body to drum sounds that are too thin. And I use it all the time, especially when designing like my own sounds for projects like that. The next thing I added was this Analog Machines plugin by Universal Audio to kind of compress and drive the signal. I have it on the warm setting and push the drive all the way up to 100. The last thing I added was this sample delay because I wanted the groove to be more laid back, so I want the snare to come in a little bit late. And this sample delay just kind of shifts the sound without actually moving the MIDI or moving the audio. The next sound that I added was this snap. Again, same technique that I used on the snare before. I just recorded a bunch of snaps, different positions around the microphone, and layered those together, threw them into Logic Sampler, added a fade. For this, the only processing is a channel EQ with a low cut, and that's what it sounds like. When recording human percussion like that, definitely experiment with recording it at a softer volume, because that's where I feel all of the texture is. If I record a snap like super loud. I feel like it tends to sound more like a digital snap, and this is more human in a sense. Maybe that's only how I feel, but I just like experimenting with recording stuff super soft because I like those kind of textures a lot more than the harsh ones. Just something to try out. The next thing that I added was this perk. Again, I think I just hit like my microphone stand or something like that and recorded it. Logic sampler again, cut out the sound, added a fade, added a EQ. This is what it sounded like before. And here's width. I added this analog machines plugin again, just to add a little bit of drive. The next percussive element is this one called construction. I remember there was some construction outside and someone was hitting something, and to me it sounded really cool. So I just opened up my window and it just came up with this sound. Again, I threw it into Logic Sampler, cut it up, added a fade. To make it sound a lot more percussive, I added this Cashmere Essentials Kick plugin, which is basically like a transient shaper. This is a free plugin too, so definitely go grab that. The next thing that I added was this Lexicon reverb. I chose this preset called Fat Drum Plate, and I didn't even change anything about it. I just left it the way it is. After that, added an EQ. Filtered out a lot of frequencies, I guess, to make it sit better in a mix. And after that is a pan automation. It's just putting it to the left. I could have just panned it as well, but yeah. The very last thing that I added was this hi-hat. So as I showed you, there is some processing on most of these sounds, but besides that, what I always do is group all of my drum sounds together, put them in a drum bus, and put the SSL compressor on that, because it's just really good at gluing all of those different sounds that are coming from different sources together. And I usually go with this Chicky subtle glue preset, and I just make sure it doesn't go above 4 dBs of compression, and that just helps make the drums sound a lot more cohesive. Now that we have the drums down, let's move on to the bass, which is also super simple. So I'm kind of alternating here between an electric bass and a Moog bass. The electric bass actually comes from my electric bass. I actually played that in. There's a preset in Logic's stock bass amp designer called Deep, and the only thing that it does is boost the bass like crazy, takes out all the mids and all the highs, and almost compresses it to the max. It just makes it sound like a synthesizer, like an 808, and I really like that. The Moog bass that I'm using comes from this Universal Audio Mini Moog plugin. I really like this tuba Moog bass preset that they have, especially because the lower the velocity that you play it with, the less overtones, like higher frequencies the note has. It almost only has like super subby frequencies, but also this really cool noise. For processing, I just use this Pultec EQ by Universal Audio. The only other thing that I added bass-wise is this 808. We can listen to that in context as well. The 808 that I use here is by Johnny Wood. Shout out Johnny. I treated it with a high cut and another Pultec EQ. And this is another great example of using contrast. An 808 roll like that you wouldn't usually find in like a pretty song like this. I always look for ways to make my more beautiful songs less nice and dirty them up a little bit. So I like using elements of harsher genres to just dirty up the whole thing a little bit, even if it's just for that very short moment. But I think just that short moment adds so much character to the whole thing. If we listen to it in context, I just love that moment right here. Right now that we got the rhythm section down, we can move on to the melodic elements of the song. So the first element that this whole sample started with were these string chops. My guy Nicholas sent me some insane samples and I just messed around with one of them. After I did some messing around, I just threw the messed up sample into Logic Sampler, pitched it down 1 semitone, which sounds like this. So just so you know that songs like this, they don't just happen in a few hours or in one day. I literally had this chop idea And I was really stuck for like 3 or 4 days trying to figure out how am I going to progress this. And the answer was so simple that it's like laughable almost. I just pitched it down another semitone. And now then, that was my chord progression. That's everything. Sometimes the answer is so simple, but it takes you multiple days to get to it. But in the end, it's all worth it. And that's just a part of, you know, creating something special. The only thing that I treated chops with is a basic EQ with a low cut and the tape mellow-fi to just make it sound a little bit more warped and yeah, messed up. On the group, I just have this super basic EQ and yeah, that's what it sounds like. The next thing that I added was this acoustic guitar, super simple, just recorded 2 chords, threw it into Logic Sampler, pitched it down 6 semitones, threw on this Dirty Tape plugin by Softtube, and it sounds like this. You can really hear how the tape plugin has this decoupled stereo mode, which gives you different glitches on the left and right sides. I just love the effect that that has. Let's listen to that in context with the string chops. Just kind of fills it out a little bit more. After I had those 2 elements down, I wanted to add something that had a little bit more high frequencies, because whenever I'm coming up, especially with the melodic and the harmonic part of the sample or the song, I'm thinking about frequency spectrum and what part of the spectrum is empty at that point. So the acoustic guitar and the strings, they kind of fill out the mids, low mids, high mids. So they're in the mids kind of spectrum to my ear. That's why I felt like, okay, what is missing? Of course, we already have the bass. So right now I want to add some more high frequency stuff because that is what is missing right now. So what I added was this electric guitar. Here's what it sounds like raw. And the first thing that I added was a halftime with the mix at 37%, just so the halftime adds a little bit of low-end information. Gave it kind of a weird, cool bounce as well. After that, I used this Lexicon reverb. Super subtle. After that, just a low cut, because obviously the halftime added some low end, but a lot of that was frequency-wise something I didn't want. So you hear we still have the notes in there, but we just got rid of some of that low end stuff. That was just unnecessary. Next, I added this plugin, which gave it all of its vibe. So this is the Brigade Chorus by Universal Audio. And I didn't use it on the chorus setting, I used it on the vibrato setting and just turned the rate all the way up to its max, which just makes it sound so broken, almost sounds like recording to a tape loop. It's really cool. And after that, I added a pan automation, which I like to add a lot, especially for like ear candy stuff, to just give it a lot more movement, especially because those kind of elements, they're not in your main focus. So having those elements move around, it won't take away the focus from the core elements. It would just add some really cool background movement and just keep the ears a little bit more busy and just make everything sound a lot more interesting. So it just moves from left to right. Moving on to the second electric guitar, which is a lot less busy than what I just showed you. Super simple, just fills up some space. The only thing that I added was this EQ, cut off some of the lows, and this reverb, which I have on solo mode, which just means it's 100% wet, so without the reverb. This third guitar that I added here comes in on another section and it sounds like this. You can barely hear it in the mix, but it definitely adds something. Processing wise, again, same reverb on a solo mode, so it's 100% wet. Then I added this wires plugin by Audio Thing. What it emulates is like a super low quality audio recorder, and for this guitar it just seemed fitting to me. Let's just listen to with and without. So without and with. Takes out a lot of the highs and makes it very unstable. And next, like I already told you, I love adding this pan automation plugin to all of my ear candy. So yeah, here it is again. Moving on to the flute accent, which I think is a big part of what makes this section sound the way that it sounds. So I played that in with my Xiao flute. There are 3 layers in here that make up that flute accent. Let's listen to the first one. Here's what it sounds like dry. First thing that I did was just treat that raw recording, cut out a lot of the lows, treat some of the mids here and boost the highs. Next thing that I added was the sample delay. As I was talking about before, I wanted this section to be a little bit more dragging and more laid back. So I just wanted this accent to come in a little bit later and not necessarily 100% on the one. So that's why I added that. The next thing is this digital reverb. As you might have noticed, I'm using the same reverb on almost everything, which for me really helps to just make samples and songs and whatever I'm working on sound a lot more cohesive, because everything feels like it's in the same space. Yeah, just a tip, like something to try out. Next thing that I added was this multi-band compressor. It just felt right to attenuate that 690 Hertz. Last thing is just a basic compressor, doesn't even do much. Moving on to the second one. So you can already hear it sounds a lot different. I panned this one to the right, the one before to the left. Here's the raw recording. Again, sounds almost exactly the same like the one before. I did almost exactly the same EQ move, used the same sample delay. Now here is the plugin that's making it sound the way that it sounds, which is the same Lexicon reverb. I have the solo mode engaged again, which just makes it from this to this. After that is another EQ, because a lot of the times, especially if you're adding reverbs on 100% wet, it might introduce some frequencies again that you don't necessarily like. So I just used another EQ to take care of those. And that's basically it for that layer. The last layer that I added to this flute accent sound like this, which is me singing. The fact that it's turned down a lot in the mix to a point where you can almost not hear it at all tells me that I thought this was a really great idea, but after recording it, didn't think so anymore. But I didn't want to delete it, so it's still in here, but like super low. Processing that I did on here is tape echo, super basic EQ, and again the same sample delay to just put it in the same timing as everything else. Now on the flute accent group there is some processing as well, just a compressor to kind of glue all of those individual layers together, the Universal Audio Studio tape recorder for some saturation, and tape mellify to just make it flutter a bit. And that's basically that layer. The next thing that I added was this choir right here. So I recorded this choir 7 semitones higher on purpose because I wanted to give it a dirtier vibe by pitching it down afterwards. So originally it sounded like this. Then obviously I pitched it down. Processing wise, taking care of those mids again, like I told you about earlier, 150 to 500 is usually the type of frequencies that I focus on when trying to take care of muddiness that I don't like. After that, compressor, kind of gluing all of the individual takes together that I did, and in the end, a super short reverb. It just gives it a touch more space. After pitching it down, I felt like it was kind of going under in the mix. So I just copied that exact choir and pitched it up an octave and mixed it in very quietly to just add a little bit of high-end energy. The next thing in here are these tremolo strings. These are from another project that I did with my boy Nicholas, and I just grabbed them from there. You can see right here I kind of pitched the individual notes around to create a chord that matches the general harmony of the song. There's no processing on the individual tracks. I'm just panning them a little bit to the left and a little bit to the right. The whole string group is treated with an EQ, again getting rid of some of the lows, boosting the highs. Tape recorder, which I use on all of the live string recordings that I get. I just put this on because it saturates them in a very nice way. After that, using a plate reverb and again a pan automation. Right here I pulled the mix down to 50% because it's not really an ear candy, but it's not really a main element, so I kind of chose an in-between path, and altogether it just sounds like this.
Why the biggest mouth got the most ears? Blurry faces talk about something real and thick.
I think it adds like a very interesting cinematic type of vibe to this section. The next element that I added is this cricket sound. If you go into the iPhone settings and choose a ringtone for your notifications, you're going to find this sound in there. And I just recorded it in. There's no time quantization on it. It just creates this insanely interesting kind of bounce in combination with the rest of the track. If you listen more closely to the cricket sound, what it does to the overall bounce. Processing wise, here's what it sounds like raw. The first thing I added was this tape echo. Feedback's all the way down, so it just creates this kind of slapback effect. After that is again the lexicon reverb. Next, using the Analog Machines plugin again on the warm setting, drive is on 50 and a little bit of the warble. And at the end of the chain is the Dirty Tape plugin by Softtube again. On the worst setting where it's doing the most amount of dropouts and those glitches that I really like. Next, I added this bow effect, which I got out of some sample pack. It's just a very messed up bowing over a string and not really knowing what you're doing, but it sounded cool and I added it on like every other snare hit, and in combination it just sounded really cool. And I kept this one dry because it just felt right to have that sound right in your face. The last instrument that I added was this electric guitar. Before moving on to the vocals, let's talk about two things automation-wise. So the first thing that I didn't even talk about is that the intro of the song is in 4/4, and after that the main part is in 3/4. Another thing that I did to make the first part of the main section more interesting, and which is the reason why I have all of the melodic elements in one group, is that I pitched the whole first section down one semitone by using Logic's stock pitch plugin. So right when that first section is about to end, I'm automating the pitch plugin to go back to normal, which sounds like this. And you might have heard the plugin is not doing it in a clean way at all. So there's those little digital artifacts in there, and there's even a dropout right before the drop. Like there's a split second where everything just goes silent, and I just fell in love with how it did that. So I didn't do anything about it. It just was perfect. Alright, moving on to the vocals. The first thing that I want to talk about are the rap vocals. Let's just listen to them soloed.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces talk about something real and dig it. No cheers, no tears, no fears.
So let's just look at the main vocal first.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
Without any effects, it sounds like this.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces talk about something real and dig it. No cheers, no tears, no fears.
So So just so you know, this doesn't just come out of me like that instantly. Those are multiple takes where I just picked out the best parts where I felt like my performance was pretty good, and I just comped all of that stuff together until I have one take where I just feel like I can work with that. The first thing that I added was this 2 preamp again to just give it a little bit more aggressiveness, a little bit more attack.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
After that is a basic EQ.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
Again, like I told you before, looking for frequencies in that 150 to 500 hertz range. And I actually didn't want to take away too many of the lows because I feel like, especially for rap vocals, that's where a lot of the character sits as well. So I just kept the low cut at like 50 hertz.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
After that is a compressor.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
Probably could have done a lot more compression than that, and then a de-esser.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces talk about something real and dig it, no cheers.
And now, because the whole intro is pitched down a semitone, I also pitched down the vocals a semitone.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
The quality of the pitched vocals definitely isn't the best. Like if you listen to it solo, it doesn't sound that great. But in the context of the mix, it
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
It works really well. So the next thing I do after getting that main take down is doubling the vocals in various ways. So the first way that I always do, which is super basic, is just wrap it the same exact way like I did in the main take, and just do 2 takes of that and pen those hard left and hard right and layer it with the main vocal.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
Just EQ.
Or something real and dig it, no cheers.
And compression on there. The next thing that I did here is just give certain words or certain lines a little bit more impact.
Biggest mouth got the most ears. Talk about something real, dig it, no cheers, no fears.
So right here I have a kind of call and response effect going on, which is really cool, alternating between like a higher double and a lower double. Next thing that I added was this deep layer.
Why the biggest mouth got the most ears.
Again, rapping the exact same thing but in like a super deep voice. Same exact signal chains before, preamp, EQ, compressor, de-esser. And that's it. The last thing that I added, which I always love doing, especially on rap vocals, is this whisper layer.
Why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces talk about something real and dig it, no cheers.
I just take away most of the lows from those takes and just pan them hard left and hard right, which is a very cool, organic kind of way to add a little bit more width to your rap vocals. So altogether, the rap vocals sound like this.
Wondering why the biggest mouth got the most ears. Blurry faces talk about something real and dig it, no cheers, no tears, no.
Alright, let's move on to the last part of the track, which are the main singing vocals. Like we did before, let's listen to it soloed.
Yeah. Paper and some bitches, but they can never fuck with my love. Fuck with my love. Yeah. Might stay unknown, but never alone. My love. Love. Yeah. Yeah. My love. Love.
Alright, starting with the main take, and just to be transparent, to kind of show you the process, I'm doing like 5 to 6 takes of the exact same thing and then taking little pieces of every take where I feel like I performed it really well, and in the end I have something that I can work with. The first thing that I do before doing any other processing is transferring all of that into Melodyne and tuning the vocals. I mostly like to keep the tuning as minimal as possible, so just so you know, because there is no auto-tune in the signal chain right here, that I did tune the vocals before treating them with anything else. So here's what they sound like just with tuning.
Paper and some bitches, but they can never fuck with my love.
Same processing chain, preamp. After that, a basic EQ.
Paper and some bitches, but they can never fuck with my love.
Next thing, just like I showed you before, a compressor.
Paper and some bitches, but they can never fuck with my love.
Compressing a little bit more than with the rap vocals right here. I'm going down to like -5. And also, like I showed you before, the S.
Paper and some bitches, but they can never fuck with my love.
And after that is a plate reverb.
Paper and some bitches, but they can never fuck with my love.
So the next layer that I added is this reverb layer. And of course, sometimes I use buses to work with my reverbs, but a lot of the times, especially when I'm trying to automate them, I like having a reverb audio track like this, where it's just faster and easier for me to manipulate and automate the reverb. For example, right here, I just changed the automation mode to like latch or write. And as you can see, I pulled up the volume of the track right before those gaps where I'm not singing anything. So in context, this is what it sounds like.
Fuck with my love.
It fills out those breaks, you know.
Stay unknown, but never alone, my love.
Fills out the gap. So those are the main vocals done. After that, I recorded some basic harmonies to accentuate some parts.
They can never fuck with my love.
And if you're thinking right now, damn, this sounds horrible, then you're definitely right, because it does. I mean, solo, they kind of sound like shit, but if you play them in context,
they can never fuck with my love.
It doesn't really make a difference. This is like a huge tip that I can give you for choirs as well, because what I see a lot of people doing is take what they sang in and they just tune it to 100% perfection. So every layer of their harmonies, every layer of their choirs, it just sounds like a robot, and that's when it begins to sound like a vocoder or almost like a synthesizer. And at least I don't want that in my choirs. I don't want that in my vocals. As long as you have like one main thing that the listener can focus on, that, you know, pitch wise is in a good place, then all of the other stuff doesn't really matter that much.
But they can never fuck with my love.
It's not sung that well, but it's sung well enough, you know, so it works. There's almost no processing on this stuff. Just cut out some of the lows, treated some muddiness and boosted the highs.
My love.
The next thing that I added was this
love.
Just this love. I'm just saying love, and it just hits on every other snare. The very last thing that I recorded were these ad-libs.
Yeah, fuck with my...
Which I think just has the power to make any kind of vocals sound a little bit more alive and a little less perfect and a little less, you know, programmed and all of that stuff. I'm just doing one take here and freestyling some yeah, ah, or whatever I'm saying. Only thing that I'm doing on those is a low cut and a gate. Alright, so now that we've gone through all of these single elements, the last thing that I want to talk about is my mastering chain. This chain is almost exactly the same on all of my songs, on all of my samples, on everything that I do. The first thing that I'm using is this ARTG mastering chain by Waves. I made my own preset, which gives me a really good starting point for everything that I'm doing. You can copy those settings if you like. For the input, I just turn it down a little bit because the signals that I'm working with are usually very loud. EQ wise, you can see right here in the middle, I'm boosting the lows, and on the side, we're like boosting the highs, which makes the lows more focused in the middle and the highs a little bit wider, which just helps the overall stereo image of your track really open up while still keeping it super clean. There's a little bit of limiting going on in this limiting section, a little bit of filtering at the end. I use a very small amount of this spreader right here. Always be aware of like plugins that make your stuff wider, because they can really mess up your phase. So always check your phase with the correlation meter. The next thing I'm adding is this Capital mastering compressor by Universal Audio. I always use this Warm Capital preset. The last thing in the chain is Logic's stock compressor. I always use this Opto Slow release preset, and it basically adds a soft clipper / limiter. This is the very first breakdown that I did where I didn't have any kind of script at all. So yeah, man, it was tough for me to just come up with stuff to say. I still hope it was somewhat entertaining and that you learned something and that it inspired you. Like I said, you can listen to the song on all streaming services. You can download the instrumental with the stems for free on my Patreon. If you want to support what I do, consider subscribing to me over there. I want to do bi-weekly videos from now on, so definitely let me know what you're interested in, what you want to know. I'll definitely keep doing these breakdowns of stuff that I posted on Instagram. As always, I really appreciate you taking your time watching this, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. Love.